Good afternoon. Happy Wednesday. Yes, it's Wednesday. So happy that you guys are here. So today I'm going to talk about the secret power of shoulder mobility. I absolutely love the shoulder. I think I love it so much because it is so complicated, but also because I often say shoulder issues often are a matter of when and not if. And I'll be diving into a little bit of why that is the case, why shoulder issues tend to be so prevalent, and what key place shoulder mobility plays in that of avoiding, a lot of the shoulder pain, aches, cracks, pops, catches, and just limitations that most people tend to experience at least some point in time in their life. So today I'm going to kind of unpack, what exactly is the shoulder, what makes it up, why it's so important to have shoulder mobility in order to, stay pain-free, to keep active. Definitely make sure that you stay out of the OR. And away from injuries. And I'll definitely dive into why this is so important for women, especially women over 40, and why there tends to be kind of an uptick when you're in your 40s and 50s, where really a lot of shoulder injuries or serious kind of, pain or pathologies, things that tend to happen once you kind of hit 40 and 50, what's going on there. So, and then also I'll walk you through a little test we'll kind of test our shoulder mobility and see where you're at. And I'll kind of walk you through why when certain areas are limited, what it can be an indicator of, and then what it can be, I always talk about that unraveling thread, what can be the writing on the wall if you're limited in a certain area of mobility or how your shoulder is, and what that unfortunately could potentially lead to, and then what you can do to make sure that you kind of just nip it in the butt and it doesn't kind of start to become this kind of cycle of aches and pains. And then also then wrap it all up and talk about what you can do if you feel like your shoulders are really tight, if you're noticing that the mobility isn't there, if you're stiff, if your arms or your shoulders are a little weak, and you're noticing that it's influencing your ability to take off a tight sports bra, get in a sports bra, go swimming, reach up into that tall cupboard, reach into the back seat to grab your purse. All those type of things can be early little signs that there's definitely a limitation or something brewing in your shoulder that we definitely need to address. So before I dive in, my name is Dr. Yvonne Castillo, and I'm a pain-free movement specialist, and I am also a doctor of physical therapy, and I specifically love helping women over 40 just achieve their healthy, active, pain-free life, and doing it all with a holistic approach and naturally, so we can kind of say bye-bye to depending on pills and painkillers and then procedures. So let's dive right on in. Okay, so first let's just break down what your shoulder is. So your shoulder is, and I'll take off my jacket because it may be a little bit easier to demonstrate. So your shoulder, and we actually call it, it's pretty interesting, but it's actually called, it's a joint. So it is the type of joint it is I'll just kind of say it, but it's a ball and socket joint. And the reason that they say that, so if this is my shoulder, this is my arm bone, it's called your humerus. It sits in a socket like this. Well, the beautiful thing of our shoulders, and you'll see some parallels in the hip as well, but we have all this mobility. That's a possibility in the shoulder. We can move in all these different directions. So anytime you have a lot of mobility, the trade-off will be stability in through there. So unlike, our knees that don't have kind of all that, what we say they can move in this kind of total circumference in through there, it's just a hinge joint. So there's a lot more stability in things like your knee versus in your shoulder. With all that mobility in through there, the trade-off will be that there's a little bit, hi Lynn, welcome, I'm just diving in. So with that option to have all that mobility in your shoulder, what happens is there's a trade-off with stability, and that's why you'll see a lot of the injuries and pathologies that tend to happen specifically with the shoulder. Your shoulder is comprised of your arm bone, so your humerus in there, and it sits in a socket, and it will sit in a little bit of a groove, which is called your scapula, and then also it kind of attaches to your kind of main frame through your clavicle, which is a bone that just goes across here. And then also your scapula is what holds it in the back to your back side. And actually what really holds your shoulder in place, it depends on a lot of the muscles. So that's why it's actually called a floating joint, because there's not a whole lot of bones or places where it's strongly affixed. Actually, the only joint where it's really tightly affixed to kind of your main kind of center body is just right at your sternum and your clavicle. So that is very interesting. And again, that you'll see as I dive in a little bit deeper why it's so important to make sure that not only that we have that mobility, but that mobility is balanced with a level of stability. And that stability will be provided mostly by your muscles. And then also we'll talk about some movement patterns as well and why things tend to go awry. So with that, having just that extra mobility, it's a ball and socket joint. So then your arm can move in all different types of directions. And what we say is circumferentially is where it can move in just circular motions. You can move across the body, and all different planes of movement, which we need because we need to use our arms and we need to move in all different types of directions and through there. So with that added mobility, again, we lose a little bit of stability and through there. And that's why you'll see it will be put under a lot of, with our arms too, we tend to use them a lot. So with that kind of repetitive motions and through there, they can also get, pardon me, compromised and put under a lot of stress, the joint, but then the muscles as well. So, okay, so then also let's now dive into why shoulder mobility is so important. So you can only be kind of as strong and kind of be as active as you have the kind of range of motion that you can move into. If I can only move, excuse me, my arm up over here, that's going to limit me, and I'm not going to be as strong, as stable in my back and my shoulder, and also that's going to greatly limit what I can do in my life. And when you stay in that kind of short ranged of motion for an extended period of time, whether that's days, weeks, months, and years, your body will adapt to no longer moving all the way, being able, and oftentimes we'll see like people become very limited in being able to reach up all the way overhead. Well, if you, because of any sort of underlying issue, can no longer reach overhead, well then that joint isn't going to be stimulated to move. It's going to get kind of arthritic and crunchy and grindy. And then also too, those muscles are going to shorten. They're only going to, because they're being trained through a smaller range of motion, they're only allowed to be as strong and through that range of motion. And then so if you're ever stressed or put in a position where you do have to reach overhead and you don't have the mobility or the strength to actually do that, that's where we see a lot of issues happen, and either that an injury will develop, or some sort of trauma to the tissues that kind of hold your shoulder and comprise of your shoulder. So that's why it's really important to have that mobility. And then also too, because if we're not mobile and we don't have that motion to use, again, we become extremely limited in our life. Specifically with the shoulders, it's kind of interesting that it was like, just like anything, it's not like you're just going to wake up tomorrow and you can't lift your arm up overhead. It's often something that happens pretty subtly over time. And just because we can kind of compensate or move around it really, and also we convince ourselves like, oh, it's not that bad. And your body starts to do different things, or you just altogether just avoid doing a certain activity or a certain motion. That's how there tends to be a progression of injuries, of pain, of limitation, until you finally get to a point where you're just extremely limited, especially with your shoulders. Again, it's how we do almost everything. We need our arms to do everything. So that's why it's really important. And then specifically for women, and then women over 40, you want to think you've at that point in time kind of logged, like as I say, you've logged 4 decades on your life. I mean, oftentimes when you're in your 40s, you've, gone through your 20s and your 30s where you're really active, and now you've had a job for a certain period of time. And again, with our jobs and our occupations, that typically tends to be that you are now doing some sort of repetitive activity over and over and over again, Monday through Friday, Monday through Saturday, whatever that is. I can use an example of a nurse. So if you're a nurse, that could be, for, over, 2 to 3 decades, you're now transferring patients. You're constantly reaching over and across. You're constantly lifting things up. Or if you're at a desk, you have a desk job that you're stuck in that position. Well, over time, doing that repetitive activity, again, Monday through Friday, and you fall into those patterns, we'll start to see that it'll influence the shoulder. Same thing too, or the body in general, logging that 4 decades of life, whatever you do for activity. Could you be a tennis player? Could you be a swimmer? So we start to see the manifestation of just doing repetitive activities over and over again. And oftentimes people don't really know how to balance these, and I'll say stressors, but don't think stressors as it has a negative connotation. It's just that your body will get stressed, life will get tossed at you, you will engage in things, and oftentimes we're not doing the things to bring balance or recovery to our body. And then also too, there's natural physiological changes that will happen over time in regards to, you know, how lubricated our joints are, how we lay down bone, how much muscle mass we can put on at a time. There's hormonal changes that will change all these things, and definitely as we start to get into kind of pre or perimenopausal, that has a huge factor of, you know, our ability to heal, to, you know, handle inflammation, you know, and once you have these little nicks and injuries, is how quickly can the body heal itself, and having that kind of, and just with aging over time, there's natural physiological changes. Not that that's going to be any sort of permanent limitation, but it's something that you acknowledge. So, and then also, I think for women too, especially in their 40s and 50s, I always start to see patterns of healing, how people recover, that they start to become more prone to certain injuries. And also, let's just be honest, like, women do everything. So it's like you're working, you're handling all like the household chores. I mean, if you've had kids, I mean, that means that you've carried kids, nursed kids. I mean, you're doing everything for your kids. You're doing the cooking and the cleaning and the household chores and the gardening. That's a lot of mileage to put on your body. And then on top of that, you know, our bodies start to change, and you're noticing things aren't necessarily as perky as they once were, or the shoulders are looking a little bit different, and you're starting, and then people will often be like, okay, well, now I want to kind of like change that. So they will go into activities that not necessarily that their body is prepared to do. So that's oftentimes why we tend to see injuries start to really creep up in their 40s and 50s. The common injuries that we tend to see are things like shoulder impingement, which impingement basically refers to your rotator cuff that sits inside of the shoulder starts to get compressed over time because it's weak, and it gets irritated and it gets inflamed, and then ultimately that can lead to things like rotator cuff tears. You tend to see sometimes arthritis and bone spurs develop. And because too, just the natural physiological way women's shoulders are, that we don't tend to have that much of a mass. That's why you'll tend to see that women, and I always get like a huge uptick of women in their 40s and 50s that come in with, you know, rotator cuff injuries, rotator cuff impingements. But for men, because they tend to have more muscle mass in their shoulders, there's a little bit of a protective effect that it takes them until they're like in their 60s or 70s, where they start to show up a lot of those injuries. Another injury or thing that we'll tend to see is frozen shoulder, which is a little bit different, and there's an autoimmune component to it, but women are particularly prone to getting frozen shoulder, and that is an actual stiffening and scarring down and inflammation of the joint capsule itself. So those are just some things that we tend to see women are more prone to, and that where shoulder mobility plays such a big, key, important role into avoiding things like rotator cuff tears, impingement, having an inflammatory cascade that could potentially lead to frozen shoulder, and then arthritis, the onset of arthritis. So, and then let's see. Okay, and so let's dive into, and we'll do a little test now, of like how to check your shoulder mobility and what is quote unquote normal range of motion. And I just want to preface that everybody's body's a little bit different, and that's kind of like a spectrum of the range. And so there's, you know, at least when you're thinking like full range of motion, at least kind of sometimes being around like 90% is good. Now that will also be prefaced on, well, what do you do if you are, you know, a tennis player and you need a lot of overhead motion, if you're a swimmer, if you're, you know, in your work life, well, if you need that extra range of motion, it becomes really, really important. So we'll dive right on in, and I'll kind of walk you through the kind of the main range of motion and the mobility of the shoulder, and I'll kind of talk through if any one range is limited, what it could potentially lead to. So we'll kind of start. So the main way a lot of people tend to see that they don't have shoulder mobility is they'll lose kind of overhead motion of their shoulder. And you should be, as you kind of reach up and go this way, you should be able to have it so your arms are somewhat close to your ears, but you should have it so you can reach all the way overhead. What I tend to see over time is people really start to get limited, and they're limited to right about there. And that'll go oftentimes, again, to tap back into what I talked about posture, is because over time they tend to be here. And you can see, you can do this little test, but if you're rounded forward this way, you're gonna be about, that's as much as I can lift my shoulder. Versus if I'm upright and I have this ability to have extension through my spine, and I have that mobility of the spine, I'll be able to lift my arms up a little bit more. Also too, the muscular restriction will go into that as well. And again, it's somewhat of a chicken and an egg thing when people are thinking like, oh, is it the joint mobility or it's the muscles? They go hand in hand and they'll feed into each other. So that overhead motion, you should be able to lift up all the way. And then likewise, if you kind of go out to the side, this is called abduction, but you should be able to kind of glide those shoulders and they should be able to reach up by your shoulders. Oftentimes what I'll start to see is when people start to get limited, they'll be in through here. And then what you can look for too is, well, am I, twisted on one side? Is one side a little bit different than the other? And with this is kind of a test, but you should be able to go up. And sometimes what I will see is people as they're going up, what happens is their arm kind of twists and turns this way. To me, that tells me that there's a level of limitation and restriction in the muscles in between their shoulder blades and their front of the pack. So that creates this kind of twisting and moving motion versus that they should be able to just to take that arm and it should just glide all the way upward. When there is that limitation with that having that range all the way out, what people tend to do is when they go to lift or when they have to go reach for something, they can only get their shoulder up so far. So what do? They use their neck and they try to use that neck muscle to reach it up a little bit more. That's why you'll see, that a little bit more muscle mass on one side of the neck than the other, while you'll start to see that people will also have, neck pain, neck issues, neck stiffness, neck tightness. The relationship between your neck and your shoulder, they go hand in hand. They share a lot of muscles that go from your neck. They'll attach into your scapula and they'll attach into your shoulder and they'll create the issues as well. So they feed into each other. So that's why oftentimes people will be like, okay, well, then the neck issues start the shoulder issue, did the shoulder issue start the neck issue? And oftentimes they'll feed into each other and it's sometimes hard to tease out which one actually started the other. So that's what we tend to see. So that's kind of forward motion in through there and then also side motion in through there. The other big motions that we tend to see are really, really limited in most people. And that's because, again, we tend to be so tight in the front of our chest. We tend to be more rounded forward, but we'll lose what's called external rotation. So your ability for your shoulders to move out towards the side. And you should be able to have it where your elbows can be tight into your side and you can move out and you can be at 90 degrees. What we tend to see is people will be shortened, but what happens, they're like, oh, I can do that motion. But what happens is they'll kind of do this type of a thing. And that tells me that they tend to be tighter in the back of their shoulders. There's a level of limitation within that joint. And with this motion and through their external rotation is really, really important. Not only do we lose that range of motion, but we tend to be weak in that muscle. And that's one of your rotator cuff muscles. And that's what your rotator cuff you should think of as kind of the core of your shoulder. And it keeps your arm bone, your humerus, kind of in a place where it can roll nice and supported. When the rotator cuff is not as strong as it needs to be, what happens is that shoulder is allowed to gravitate up and it creates an impingement in the shoulder, and that's what will tend to damage some of the rotator cuff tendons, lead to inflammation, lead to impingement, and also that kind of bone contact leads to some bone spurs developing, and sometimes you'll see arthritis. So that's kind of like the cascade that tends to happen. So ideally we'd have external rotation that would go all the way out to the side. When you tend to see that the arm bone can't roll in there, there's a level of limitation in the front of the pack, the muscles that go in between your shoulder blades, and then also the joint capsule can be tight as well. Conversely, there's your external rotation, but you should also be able to internally rotate too, and where your arm can go across your body, again, without the whole thing rolling in. And then likewise, another motion, which is really important, is most people can't put their hands behind the back of their head. They can't get this type of external rotation and movement without kind of craning up, things getting really limited and tight, and that will be caused to a lot of limitation to the back of the shoulder and then also inside as well. Another range where people tend to be really, really limited, and you can kind of try this, so most people cheat. You can try doing this on the ground or against the wall, but you should be able to get your arms where they're at a 90 degrees and they're out towards the side. What tends to happen is most people can't have that level of mobility. They'll be tight in their back or tight in their pec where it looks something like this, or they're out in front, or it's a little bit out in front of their shoulder. And that's where we'll run into issues where people have to reach up overhead, or they have to do a motion like they're reaching backwards or going across their body. Is not having that type of motion. Again, it compromises the shoulder in there. And then another motion that people tend to be really limited is just putting their hand behind their back and through there. So that's, that'll influence too, like reaching in your back pocket, or when you have to put on a tight jacket, people will be limited, and oftentimes they'll feel it in their shoulder. So with what tends to happen too, and one thing I don't like, and I've seen this exercise given a lot for people, where they're like, oh, you've got tight shoulders, and they have you put your hand behind your back, and then they'll kind of have like a rope, and they'll have you pull it up and down. I do not like that one, because, and I'll tell you why. This internal rotation, the shoulder, what it does to the shoulder is it puts it in a place where you really start to compress some of the rotator cuff if you don't have good mobility, and people tend to be the most limited, and it really, when you kind of reach it upwards, it tends to create more of an impingement in through there. There's far better ways to get a stretch. I don't like that one. So if someone's told you to do that, don't do that. I do not like it. I just saw another person online showing that, and I was like, oh, I don't like that. So yeah, be mindful. And that's another thing too, is what happens is the shoulder doesn't like to be compressed, and it typically tends to be compressed and you lose motion when you're internally rotated. And if there's any sort of cross body movement. So that's why most people, when they kind of reach for something and they're turning down, they're reaching down, or anything at kind of shoulder height, that's where you have the least range between your shoulder and its ability to move. So that'll be like when people do quick movements or across, something reaching across or doing something like that, or anything thumb down, anything like that, they're cleaning through there, it tends to be irritating into the shoulder. So that's just some quick little tips. Let me know if that makes sense, or maybe if you've ever experienced it, you're like, oh yeah, when I actually reach downward, or if I ever am across the body, that tends to be when I'm a little bit more painful, or even something like trimming the hedges and you're constantly at this level, it just creates a little bit more impingement. There's not that much room within the shoulder, and that's where we tend to see a little bit of kind of compromise into there. But the kind of, just a good way to kind of segue is like, well, what do I do to make sure that those motions aren't painful, that I'm strong in those motions, and I can do things like, throw a ball overhead, or put on a tight sports bra, or take off a clothes, or put on a tight jacket. That's what kind of will, when I touch on it, if you want to think of, when you're thinking of, well, what do I do for shoulder mobility? It's not just a matter of like, oh, I just have to do these stretches. You really have to think, like I say, and I will hammer this home forever and ever, but it's those three different parts, the three different parts of the mobility method that I teach, that you need to release whatever is restricted, that being muscle in through there, that being the capsules that surround your joints in through there. Then you need to go and train your body to move through those motions. So whether that's, a static stretch or a more dynamic stretch where you're moving through that range of motion, that's the next phase in through there. And then once you have that mobility, it becomes really important to have the strength. Oftentimes what we will see that most people are limited in their mobility because there's a level of weakness, so that they can't move appropriate through that range of motion. So things just tighten down. And oftentimes the mistake a lot of people think is like, oh, I'm limited in that range of motion. They want to just like jump straight for it and do the only thing that they think of doing is a bunch of stretches or a lot of mobility work. And you have to do all three pieces. And really importantly too is if you just do all the stretching and you're just released, well, you're a very unstable shoulder. And I see that happen all the time is people want to just do the mobility work, but they're not really doing any of the strengthening work, especially specifically with the shoulder, the rotator cuff, which think of it as your core of your shoulder. If you're not strong in those muscles, and you go to do higher level activities or any activity, it's like that's where people will run into cycles of pain or injury. So again, really important to kind of have those three components into there to help work on that shoulder mobility. And so just to kind of wrap it all up and to kind of put it in place. So what do I do if my shoulders are kind of tight, stiff, achy, or tight? So it's really important to know that it's more than just the shoulder. Oftentimes what we'll see too is people have really stiff upper backs. Well, if your upper spine is stiff, your shoulder blade can't glide the way it needs to, and it makes you kind of work like you're like a chunk and that shoulder can't move. Well, if you just think, oh, it's just my shoulder, and you just look up exercises, what do I do for a tight shoulder? But your thoracic spine is really curved or you're really stiff in that spine, you're never going to be able to lift that arm overhead because it needs to glide down and go through certain mobilities. Same thing too is mobility of the neck, strength of your core. So you really have to think whole body, even when you're like, oh, I know my shoulders are tight. There's a lot more that comes into that. So don't just limit yourself in thinking that, but likewise, it doesn't have to be complicated. It doesn't mean that you have to do 5 million things to, again, get that shoulder mobility that you need. But you do need to think of more holistically, because that's why I'll always see people just struggling, continue with shoulder issues, limited shoulders, is because they're not addressing their whole body and how everything is tied together, especially with the shoulder, because like I said, it's a floating joint and it really just relies on a lot of muscle support to kind of keep your arm attached to you. And then also just targeting the specific needs. Once it is identified, okay, well, what is going on, making sure that we're hitting all of those things. And again, also hitting those three components that you want to release what is restricted. We want to move and stretch and gain that mobility, but then we also want to make sure that we're stabilizing and we're practicing proper movement patterns so that when you're moving your arms and you have that new mobility, you're doing proper patterns. Again, you're not just, lifting your shoulder up by hiking your neck up and breaking those patterns too. I did include this in the Pain-Free Body Blueprint as a little bit of that first opening kind of rolling out and release. That's really, really helpful. That's kind of one of the portions that I'll typically get my clients that are struggling with shoulder issues or neck issues. It's a big good start, and then we kind of layer in those other pieces. So if you have any questions about this, please put your comments below, or you can DM me and we can talk a little bit more specifically and dive into exactly what you're dealing with. So just to kind of bring it all home, we talked today about, the importance of shoulder mobility. What the heck is a shoulder? We then walked through a little bit of a test of, the different types of shoulder range of motion, and what could possibly potentially go awry when you don't have that ideal mobility. And then lastly, we just kind of brought it all home with talking about, well, what can you do to improve your shoulder mobility? So, and please don't forget to put your vote in for the mobility class that you want me to teach tomorrow, the movement class, that you want me to teach tomorrow. And then just stay tuned because I'm putting in some things together and a little bit of this resource toolkit that will actually walk you through, okay, what is the full phase of a program that I would need to do to tackle things like shoulder pain and back pain. So the more you kind of tell me what you're liking and what you need, that helps me kind of navigate the content and everything that I put out. So thank you so much, Lynn. Thank you so much for joining. Always so great to see you. And I will see you guys tomorrow for our movement class. All right, take care. Bye.